Hi, I'm John Barclayss and welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast.
My name is Holly Ferguson. I'm the co-host of this podcast where we explore the challenges and possibilities to eliminate workplace fatalities. In this episode, we're diving into SIF prevention learning, and joining us is our fellow Barclayss person, Alan Stevenson, who is a principal consultant with us here and a skilled QHSE professional with over 40 years experience. So welcome, Alan.
It's a long time, right?
It is.
I feel better because mine's 30 years, yours is 40 years, so that's
a long
cool.
time.
Yeah.
A long time.
Well, thanks for joining us, Alan. To get us started, I mean, where did your journey start in all of this, especially around fatality prevention?
So I got sort of introduced to quality, health, safety and environment in the mid 90s, and that was all around management systems and stuff. And then coming to Australia, I joined a consulting company here, and we were involved in some of the larger projects that were going on around that time. So that would have been 2008 onwards. And during that time, the client we were working for shifted their conversation from total recordable incident frequency rates and all that kind of stuff to serious injuries and fatalities. And I think that was around the same time that Thomas Krauss, BST, they started looking at data and trends and saying, small injuries, minor injuries are sort of decreasing, but hey, just look, fatalities aren't really making any difference. In fact, they peak periodically. Yeah. So that was the introduction to this conversation about, well, why don't we begin to focus on preventing serious injuries and fatalities? What does that look like? How do we do that? And that was my introduction to the whole thing. And since then, it sort of waned. Okay, there was critical risks, critical controls, all of that kind of stuff, life-saving rules, various organisations. I think BP were the first ones to introduce golden rules. So that was a sort of an attempt at serious injury fatality prevention. So that sort of stuck. But the real conversation around serious injuries and fatalities and monitoring them and doing something about it sort of drifted, and then in the last few years it's become a serious conversation again.
I think a lot of organisations did that work around critical risks, right? And I think unfortunately in the safety space quite often we do this work, we systemise something and then we sort of shift focus. And you're right, now it's a much more prevalent conversation again, because you've defined it, you've identified your controls, and you've got these little checking processes happening, doesn't necessarily mean it's all working, right? So I think that's been the conversation, because out of that original focus on serious injury and fatalities, a lot of organisations did go away and do work on critical risks, critical controls, and this whole verification process, and we still haven't really seen the same level of downward trend in fatalities. So something's still not quite working there.
Yeah. I think for me though, John, sometimes it's it's those low, dare I say it, it's those low probability, high consequence events which catches people out. Right? So they put controls in place for really, to be a little bit controversial, routine things within a high-risk activity, and then monitor if they're in place and all the rest of it, and then something happens and it jolts them into, well, how did that happen? The low-frequency, high-consequence type events, especially these multiple fatality situations, and they don't happen all that often, right? Whereas the smaller events happen that often, and they become very distracting, rolled ankles, bad back, twisted knee. They happen far more frequently, and that can be distracting for people on site because that's where their attention is drawn. But they're not necessarily monitoring, and it's a conversation we've been having internally recently, is the effectiveness of these controls. They're not necessarily doing that because they don't have the key indicators in place that lets them know that a control that's been identified to manage a critical risk is effective in doing what it's supposed to be doing. That's the bit that's missing, and that's what catches them out.
The big conversation we always, and I guess where we get brought in most of the time to help is leadership plays a key role in all. There's lots of things here, right? So there's lots of things that have importance within the process, and one of the things is obviously leadership matters, right? I know you've brought something in already, so talk us through something I know you're pretty passionate about and you lean on a fair bit, is the ICMM.
So the ICMM, in the mining world, the International Council of Mining and Metals, is an organisation that's been in existence for quite a long time. So they focus on critical risk management. And it's interesting, you asked me at the beginning, where did my journey start? So even back in the 90s, the mid-90s, and I had this quality, health, safety and environment role. And the organisation I was working for at the time, they'd introduced an integrated management system. It was quite novel at the time, so it wasn't just focused on health, it wasn't just focused on environment, it wasn't just focused on Q. It was an integrated management system. And the very first element in that management system is leadership commitment. And that exists in almost every management system that you see today. Whether it be quality, whether it be environmental, whether it be information security, it doesn't matter what it is. The very first element, ISO 45001, the very first element is leadership and commitment, right? So it describes what that is. It talks about policies, it talks about all of those things. But then, what are they actually talking about when they talk about leadership, right? Because we can say that, everybody in an organisation has the capability, capacity, should be a leader. But for me, really, reading between the lines, leadership is senior management, right? So what are senior management doing to enable what it is they want to happen? And again, sometimes when I'm on site, and there's the senior people on site, I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about verifying the effectiveness of their controls for their critical risks. And it was 3 of the most senior people on site, and I introduced them to the ICMM network for critical risks. It's a 9-step process. They weren't really aware of it, and step 8, I think it is verifying effectiveness. So I said, tell me your process for verifying the effectiveness of the controls associated with critical risks tasks that happen on site. I knew what was going to happen. I got a bit of a blank stare. Right? And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, so tell me how you verify the effectiveness of the controls. And again, crickets. Right? So they said, we have our critical risk, critical control verification process, task-based observations, field leadership interactions, all of those things. I said, so that's a compliance conversation, right? You have a list of one of the critical control verification sheets. I saw a list of 13 items on a list. I said, so you just verify that those 13 items are in place.
Are present.
And yes. I said, how many of them are administrative controls? And it was a few. I said, so how do you then verify the effectiveness of those admin controls that rely on people doing something? All relies on people doing something, but it relies on someone. And the easy one for me is barricading. Right, so underground there's a few places where they have to put barricades, right? And sometimes the barricade is just a few cones, right? And I can remember having one conversation with someone underground. Tell me what controls you have in place. How do you make sure nobody gets killed, seriously injured? Oh, we put the cones, the yellow cones, which stops people going beyond a certain area and into harm's way. I said, how effective are these cones? And they're not very effective, but it's a critical control, right? So it's those simple examples that I talk to people about, and you begin to get the realization that they go, okay, I'm beginning to see it now. So again, going back to this conversation with the senior guys on site, I said, you are part of this process. So are you interrogating the data that's being collected for your site? And they went, no, that happens at headquarters. I said, so you just make sure, do you actually check that your critical controls verifications is being done, that people are doing them? And then do you have a look at the data? And they went, well, no. I said, so you're not verifying the effectiveness of the controls at your work site. So what do you do?
And it becomes pretty common that they become a data input,
Yeah.
not a data verification process.
Yeah. Yeah, and then something happens, and they go, "Oh, how did that happen?"
We've been doing all this stuff.
Yes.
Well, I was going to ask, when you have these conversations with them, is it like a light bulb's going off?
You can see a little bit of recognition, right? And even if it's just a little nudge into being a bit more curious about what's going on. So then the leading conversation from that is, so what other questions could you ask that would help both you and the person in the front line get clearer on the effectiveness of the control? And again, it was on another site, and it was in a heavy vehicle maintenance area. It was the leading hand, it's the supervisor. And I just had this quick conversation with him, and we were looking at a job going on a drill, and there was some barricading. It was some pretty flimsy tape, which was all grubby and oily. And I said, okay, tell me about the controls that are in place here for this job. Tell me about the barricading. I said, you tell me if you think that barricading is effective. And he went, well, no, not really. I said, okay, so how could you? I said, I'm not going to ask you to do it now, but if you were having that conversation with someone about, what's the intent of the barricading, is to stop someone moving into harm's way. Oh, everybody around the workshop knows what's going on. They know not to go in there. I said, that's true. That's true, but it's not really the people in this area that you're worried about. It's people who've wandered into this area and suddenly they've got an opportunity just to duck in, and they put themselves in harm's way without really understanding what's going on around them. And before you know it, you have this low probability, high consequence event that you go, how did that happen? How did that happen? So I think and this guy was great. He went, oh, yeah, I see what you mean. I said, so you just be a little bit more curious when you're talking to people about controls that are in place. How effective do you think that control is? What else could we do to make it more effective? Because that's all we're striving to do, is how can we make this more effective so it does what it's intended to do more often than it doesn't.
Yeah, because if we go by the fact that all this critical risk work has been worked on over the last few decades, and the fatality rate's still not coming down at what we would hope. Some places it's still even going up, even though all these CRM processes are in place. So for me, it's sitting in. Look, I think most people know what the critical risks are. I don't think they ever get caught out on an event that wasn't already identified. I think most of the controls were present more often than not. It's just they weren't effective. And that whole effectiveness conversation, I think people want a silver bullet answer for that as well, right? How do you make sure it is effective? Well, again, that's going to depend on the work. It's going to depend on the situation. It's going to depend on the people.
Definitely.
So it's, as you say, it's the curiosity question around, in this situation, how do you know that's been effective? Like, how do you know that's been effective? Because it might have been effective over there yesterday. But is it effective over here today?
So it's just getting them to be curious about it and the routine aspect of it and what's going on. And, you might have driller A and assistant B in one day, and then tomorrow you've got driller A and assistant D the next day. You have all this constant change in the workplace. And I said, listen, I don't expect you to have this kind of conversation at every interaction. Be selective around how often you have this conversation. Once or twice in a swing, you have your compliance aspect of it, and that's okay. But you need to be a bit more interested and curious about what's actually going on. And they're usually afraid of, I don't want to insult anybody. He knows more than me. He's, I've never been a driller. They're a driller. They're an experienced driller. I said, that's a trap. Don't just assume that person is experienced, because you have this thing called drifting into failure, when people begin to miss out little steps along the way. Suddenly you have an incident.
And is that what we call normalization deviation? Is that where that comes into it?
Normalization of deviance. It's an interesting conversation. So that term, that phrase was first coined from the Challenger disaster. So that was back in 2009, and NASA had sort of drifted into normalizing the O-ring failure. They normalised it. It was okay. It's happened on previous flights, nothing bad happened. What's the worst that could happen? Oh, everybody knew what the worst that could happen, but they normalised it and off they went. And there's been various other examples over the years where that's happened. And again, when I'm on site, I cited the example of a checklist with 13 items on it. I said, okay, so what if there's only 12? And someone chooses, for whatever reason, that 13th one is not that important, right? It's not that important. If I miss that one, hey, look, nothing bad happened. Oh, isn't that cool? Right? And that drifts on, and then suddenly you only have 11 in place, so you've dropped 2, right? Nothing bad happens. Oh, it's okay. Right? But how do you know which one is the tipping point, if you like, to something bad happening? There's 13 controls, critical controls for a reason. Your job is to make sure all 13 are in place. And then sometimes they'll find one that's not in place, and then something is done in the field. It's easy enough to put up, there should be 3 yellow cones and there's only 2, so they put 3.
Yeah.
Right, so it's sort of fixed. At the time, quick conversation. I said, so, going back to the conversation I had with the senior guys on site, I said, so do you look at how many of those situations have happened over the last week or the last few days? How many times someone has ticked that box that it wasn't present, but after they had a conversation it was put in place? So what if that person hadn't gone there? What if that person hadn't had that conversation and that control wasn't in place and something bad happened?
And from my experience, it even gets, because that's one part of it, right? The data's coming in. Are we looking at the data? Is it telling us what are people looking at? What are people finding? But again, there's be interested in, well, what are people doing when they're doing that, right? So yes, that they are going out and doing their critical control verification and ticking these boxes, and some people are actually good at saying, well, no, that wasn't really the way it should have been. Like say, there's 2 cones instead of 3, so I ticked it as not compliant or not correct, so I fixed it. That's really good. But again, are we interested in how that person's actually asking questions and engaging the conversation around, as you said before, what would be even better than 3 cones, right? So are we actually being interested in not only what the data, like we're asking people to go out and collect data, are we being interested in that? Because people don't know about you, but I've experienced it a lot too, where leaders go, I don't know why I'm doing it, because no one looks at it and no one pays attention to it. So it's like this whole, why am I even doing this? So there's that bit first, but then there's, well, how are they doing it when they're doing it? I've seen quite a few times leaders go out, fill out the checklist, and then head back to the office, and they haven't even had a conversation with anyone. And I'm like, well, how do you know people understand it? How do you know people have put it in place for the right reason, and do they know why it's there in the first place? And have we actually had a conversation with them around, do they think that's work? Like, do they think it's working? Like, do they actually think it helps? And it's amazing what the team will tell you. The team will quite often tell you, I don't know why we do that. It just doesn't add any value, doesn't work at all. Okay, well, let's unpack that a bit.
It's like the 4D conversation, right? So what we're asking you to do that's dumb. It doesn't make sense. Well, putting 2 cones in front of the jumbo
doesn't make sense.
Dumb.
It doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense, but I do it.
Because I'm told to.
But it's not very effective,
And getting back into the SIF prevention learning space, when you're having these conversations with people and maybe they are curious a bit in this space, where do you direct them? How do you help encourage them on this learning journey to keep going?
I'm a big fan of curiosity and just asking questions. And it's interesting, in this little conversation I had with these guys on site about verifying the effectiveness, one of them said, well, I actually, thinking about it now, our system, so I started talking to them about closed questions, open questions, probing questions, that kind of thing. So we had a little fun piece around, here's a closed question. What does that look like if it's an open question? And they struggled a bit because most people are used to asking closed questions.
Well, give us an example.
Gosh, I knew you were going to say that. So one question I used as an example is, do you like hot weather or cold weather? Right? That's a closed question. I like hot weather. Right? There's no expansion, yeah? An open question version of that is, what's your favourite time of year? right? That's a far more creative question. So then they'll say, oh, I love the summer. What is it you like about the summer? Right? So you begin to expand. And you're asking someone something that they are probably interested in. Right? So nobody's asked them before, so do you think 2 cones is an effective barricade? No one's asked them that. They've said, do you have your barricading? Yes, tick, 2 cones. Do you think that's effective? That's a closed question, but you're beginning to get them a bit more interested. So what is it about it that you don't think's very effective, right?
What do you think would be more effective?
Yeah. So there's all sorts of places. So I think helping them develop their questioning skills, their coaching skills, their curiosity skills. Be curious. Don't assume anything. I think is where we start. And then getting to the point where... so I introduced something called learning teams. Listening tours. Listening tours is quite a well-known, established thing for management teams to do. It's dressed up in various other terminology, but basically it's called listening teams. So they, as a group, identify... They come in at the start of the swing, identify a theme, what's been happening in the last 2-3 months, get a bit more curious about what's going on. What's your theme? What are you guys really curious about? So what are maybe 2 or 3 questions that you'll use when you go out and execute this listening tour? So you've got various touch points. You go out on a Monday, engage with a few people, get some data, reconvene on a Wednesday. John, this is what I heard. John, what did you hear? Holly, what did you hear? And you hear these things and you go, oh, wow. So maybe we need to do a little bit more about that. And that gives you some access. And then you feed back to, we did this listening tour, this is what we heard, this is what we're thinking of doing. And again, it's just that little opportunity to improve what's going on is what I recommend.
And the good thing about when things shifted towards that sort of language, it's like I say, it's still called different things in different places, but fundamentally it's about triggering leaders. Your job isn't to go out and enforce things. It isn't about going out and finding things wrong. It's actually to go out and listen to your teams and seek to understand what's actually going on. And when they're done well in groups, because not many organisations still do it as groups, they all go out and do it as individuals and put data in. But when they do come back and reconvene after a few days of going out and being, asking these questions, and I'll come back to that one in a minute, but when they come back and share that stuff, let's say, it's amazing how much they all hear a similar thing, and they're like, wow, okay, we can actually do something about that. And the thing I always found interesting in these processes where organisations try to lead their leaders, their managers, whoever, to go out and ask certain questions, what I've noticed sometimes is, okay, I've got to go out and ask these 3 questions, and they go out and ask these 3 questions, but they sort of missed the opportunity that first question I asked actually had the opportunity for some exploratory questions afterwards. And it's almost like they're still falling into the trap of, I've just got to go do these things I'm being told to do. So they've asked 3 great questions and got good information because they've been able to go back and share it, but they've still missed some deeper understanding of what's going on, because I've got a great answer from that first question, but haven't been curious enough, or at least built the question muscle in them to ask a follow-up question. And it could be a closed question, or it could be a more probing question, or another open question, whatever. But I always find that intriguing. Go out and ask these 3 questions, and they do. They go out and ask those 3 questions, and limit the possibilities.
Looking into the long term, what kind of investment is required to make this work from individuals, from the organisations, either or?
Yeah, so I suppose for me, Holly, going back to leadership commitment, it's that senior leadership. So the work that I'm doing now, it's the most senior person on site making the decision, although they know, intellectually they know, the most important thing I can do when I'm on site is go to the work front. Go and talk to the people doing the job. I know that's the most important thing I can do, but other stuff gets in the way and I don't always get there. So then you have to say to them, well, you've just told me that's the most important thing you can do. So how can you make that the most important thing that you do?
Yeah.
I said, otherwise you're just standing there at the daily pre-start meeting and you're broadcasting, you're telling people what it is you want them to do. I said, you have to enable that. What are you doing to enable what you're asking people to do? You have to be down there removing the barriers, because there's barriers in place. That's why people don't do it, whether it's too hard, too difficult, dumb, whatever it is.
Too many meetings.
But, for the people in the front line, sometimes it's a bit tricky for them to do what it is you're asking them to do. Yeah. So what are you doing to enable that, so you're not just telling people what to do all the time? I can remember, John, one project we worked on together, things weren't going well on site. They were having a few injuries. They were really getting concerned. So they had this little program of safety stand-downs, which lasted weeks, right? Weeks. And it was 2 hours. It was really quite informative, well put together. And at the end of it, I can remember asking the senior person on site, I said, so I've just sat through that 2 hours, whatever it is, and you've made requests. You've made lots of requests about what it is you want people to do. I said, what are you and your leadership team going to do now to enable that? And again, I get this blank stare.
I already told them they should do what they're told.
I said, so in a few weeks' time or a few months' time, when nothing's really changed, you're going to be upset and you're going to blame them for not doing what it is you wanted them to do. We told them, we spent all this time. And then that's when we made the suggestion. I said, why don't you give them in the middle of the day? So they have the pre-start meeting, they decide what's going to happen, but it was an old facility, things broken down, it was all planned maintenance, and there was stuff happening. Planned maintenance got put aside, so they had to repair the plant to keep it going. I said, you know that in the day, for most people, what they plan on doing at 6 o'clock in the morning isn't what's happening by lunchtime. So why don't you give them 10 or 15 minutes after their lunch break, crib break, to huddle and say, okay, what did we plan doing this morning? How's it going? And what will we do? What does the rest of the day look like?
Yeah,
what do we need to do today?
What's possible?
Yeah. And what shall we leave for night shift or plan for the next day? And we got that going. I don't know if it's still in place, but we introduced it, and a few people thought, it's a bit strange, but then they enjoyed it. I said, and by the way, no forms, no reports, no nothing, just the opportunity for that team to get together, to huddle, review how things are going, and then move forward. And I said, that's a way for them that's a demonstration that you're giving them the time to do what it is you've asked them to do. So do that, and that's a simple example that always pops into my head.
And I think the long-term part of that, I think, to summarise, is organisations set through policies, procedures, role descriptions, all those sorts of things, expectations of people in the workplace. I think what we're talking about here from a leadership perspective is go out and see what's possible for people to do. So the language I used to use in a system we used to use, so what have we set out that's enabled people? Right? So what's within their control to do? What things do we ask them to do that are just difficult to do? Right? And can we make it easier? Can we do things to make it easier? But what are things we ask people to do that they can't do? Right? And literally because it's just impossible for them to do what it is we're asking them to do. And therefore then, do we need to reset that expectation? Do we need a different expectation, a different control, a different process? Or can we actually remove even more barriers to enable it? And a simple example is we ask everyone, when you're in a vehicle, to wear a seatbelt, right? So most vehicles nowadays, well designed, very, it's not hard to wear a seatbelt, right? So we've enabled people. Sometimes we've given people a really old car, the seatbelt doesn't work properly, and they can't put it on, so they don't put it on. Sometimes we put them in buses or bigger vehicles and they don't have seatbelts. So that's just a simple example where leaders do need to go out and say, okay, we've set an expectation. You have to wear seatbelts in all cars, or you have to do this. Well, now go out and find how easy it is for people to do those things. And then your job is to enable and keep improving your work design so people can actually do the things we're asking them to do.
Just another one, John, just quickly on leadership commitment. It's demonstrating, it's enabling that I'm not just asking you to do it, I want to make sure that you can do it. It's my job to make sure that you can do what I'm asking you to do. So on some sites you go to, there's buses that bring the workers to the work site, yeah. And I've been on sites where you get on the bus, it's usually a little mini coaster bus, and the only people that wear the seat belts are the driver, the front passenger, and me. Nobody else, okay, it's a 10-minute journey, nobody else puts a seatbelt on. I'm looking around, I'm thinking, what's going on there? But then you have to think, so when was the last time the senior managers on site rode the bus? They don't.
They don't. They've got their own
they've
private
got a
vehicle.
nice twin cab, Land Cruiser, to and from camp, lovely jubbly. Yeah, so I'm thinking, those are a little demonstration of, just ride the bus.
And I like that, right? Because, I mean, we throw this term around, lead by example, so much, right? And, I mean, that's another simple example, right? Well, go ride the bus. Go do what you're asking your team to do and experience it and get a sense of what's going on and what's been normalised and what's been accepted.
Yeah.
How do we actually change that? And again, another client, there was the same example.
Yeah.
And they did. They basically, all the managers over a couple of swings took the bus to and from and actually started to have conversations with people around why they weren't wearing seatbelts. Some did that well, some didn't do that as well, but that's another conversation. But again, it was a similar example of if you're curious and you're really interested and you're committed to these standards that you're trying to set, then you need to go out and experience it. You need to go out and understand it.
Because taking that to its extreme, this particular example, taking it to its extreme, there could be an incident involving the bus that it rolls over. Then they go and do the investigation. These people weren't wearing seatbelts. Oh my goodness, what happened? But that's a critical control in your
Process.
land transport process. So who's verifying that that's working? It's an extreme event, and it's an easy one to pick on, but it happens. So I think, Holly, hopefully, I think leadership, senior managers need to demonstrate. They actually have to go and do these things and find out, well, what's maybe stopping you wearing the seatbelt? What can I do that's going to help you make the decision to wear the seatbelt? Apart from telling you it's the law, apart from telling you it's in the life-saving rules,
zero tolerance
apart
policy.
from telling you all that, what is it about not wearing the seatbelt that I can help you with?
Sounds like curiosity and those open questions are the way to get through this. Thank you so much, Alan, for joining us today, and we're going to have you back. We look forward to hearing more stories, and I'll be making sure I've got some nice open questions for you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future hub on barclayss.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.